Very often we're sewing, everything's going great, and then we get stuck on some persistent issue. Well, in today's video, I want to share 5 easy ways how to fix some of the most annoying sewing headaches. Now, the first one is how to sew those very thin straps. Throughout the years, I've tried numerous different techniques. Some use very tricky sewing tactics, but I found that the most simple way is actually the easiest one. And all we need is fabric for the strap and thicker sewing thread that's at least twice as long as your strap. So now I want you to go ahead and place the strap under the presser foot with the right side facing up. At the center top, we're going to make a few back stitches to lock the seam, and then with the needle pull down, we're going to lift the presser foot and slip the middle of that long thread underneath the presser foot. Then lower the presser foot and make 1 stitch. This is going to lock the thread in place. After that stitch is done, with the needle pull down again, we're lifting the presser foot and we're folding the thread in half towards the strap side. Then we're making 1 more stitch to lock another side of the thread and finish the seam with a few back stitches. Now, this technique is going to lock that top of the thread right at the middle of the top of the strap. So next, we're folding the strap in half and we're making sure that long thread is staying right on the fold, and we're sewing a straight line along the parallel long edge of the strap where we want the strap thickness to be. Now, the tricky part here is that when you're sewing, you need to make sure you're not stitching through that thick thread. So what I like to do here is I'm just touching with my fingers and feeling if the thick thread is really staying on the fold. So once you're sewn the seam, you're going to trim down the seam allowance. We don't need a lot of seam allowance, and usually you want to leave seam allowance less than the width of your strap. Now, using very small sharp scissors, I'm going to ease in the top of my strap where we made that very first seam. I'm going to ease it into the inside of my strap, and then holding both thread ends, I'm going to start pulling the strap. Now, we're using thicker thread, but it's comparably still very thin, and because of that we can very easily pull it through the strap, and once everything is pulled out, you have created very easily very narrow strap. I have tried numerous methods, and this is the only method that works flawlessly every time. Now, another very annoying sewing headache can be when we have knit fabric and it starts to curl up. Now, there are 2 methods how we can solve this issue. So one method, very popular, is to use spray starch. We simply spraying starch on the rolling edge, press it down, and this is it. We have created the edge that is no longer rolling. And because starch is water soluble, this is not a permanent fix, and as soon as you wash the garment, it will restore its entire stretchiness and it will jump back into initial position. Now, the second method, and I probably like this method a little bit more, is we can use stretch knit interfacing on the seam allowance. Once we apply that stretch knit interfacing, the edge of the fabric is no longer going to roll. Now, why do I like this method more than using starch? It's because it's going to make sewing much easier, even very tricky, slippery knit fabrics. Not only that, but it also is going to reinforce the seam, and the seam is not going to stretch out as fast. So usually I like to use this method whenever I'm sewing like shoulders for the sweatshirt or like t-shirt, and it's a very good idea to give shoulder seam, which is cut on angle, aka it's more prone to stretching out. It's a good idea to reinforce it and give it a little bit more structure. So both methods work great, and you can try both of these and find out which one works best for you. Now that we're talking about knitwear, I wanted to share my latest creation that I'm wearing today. It's a sweatshirt that I made from a sweatshirt block that I teach in my knitwear pattern making and sewing course. Now, I took this very simple and classic block, but I added this dripping neckline, I added trapunto technique to create these DIY leathers, and of course I added a dripping hem to match the entire dripping look. So with this sweatshirt, I wanted to share that taking very classic garment, adding a few additional design details, we can truly create a very extraordinary garment that nobody else has it. I have the tutorials both for the neckline, the dripping collar, the trapunto technique, and the dripping hem, so I will link those in the description box. And if you're interested to start in making patterns for your knit garments and sewing them, I have a knitwear pattern making and sewing course where I do teach how to create patterns for t-shirts, sweatshirt, and fitted dresses, and also how to sew them using classic sewing techniques. Now, the next sewing headache, I actually didn't have this headache for quite a long time because I found two great solutions. So you know how you want to mark your fabric? You take a piece of chalk and it's dull and it doesn't leave nice thin line that you want to create. Now, I used to take my piece of chalk and sharpen it using the blade of my scissors, but that would leave a lot of mess. So my solution was to buy the chalk sharpener. I paid a few years back €3 for this, and it has worked so flawlessly. You literally take your chalk, just drive it a few times through the chalk sharpener, and that's it. You have very sharp chalk, and all the chalk powder just kind of falls inside the sharpener, so you have no mess. And second solution, actually my more favorite solution, and the solution that I've been using for over a year, is instead of using regular chalk, I've been using a chalk marking wheel. At the bottom, the marking wheel has a tiny wheel that dispenses a small amount of chalk every time you drive it through the fabric, and it leaves very thin and clear line. Now, what I like about this particular solution is that because of that wheel, it doesn't drag the fabric, and even if I'm working with very slippery fabrics, I can very easily mark them without having to drag the fabric. So if you are tired of using chalk, because chalk tends to break quite often, if you don't want to work with the dull chalk, investing in some marking wheel may be the right solution for you, and I will link a few alternatives in the description box down below. Now, this fourth solution is a little bit niche, but I still want to share it because if you're creating garments and you're using a lot of bias tape, I love sewing with bias tape, and so I like to create my own bias tape using bias tape makers. Now, the issue is that sometimes some fabrics can be very persistent and they just don't want to feed through that thin bias tape maker. Now, the popular solution is to use some sharp object to push the fabric through the maker, but I have found a method that works much better, and it works even with the most narrow bias tape makers. So we're going to take the hand sewing needle and we're going to thread it with a thread and tie a knot at the bottom. Then we're going to take the bias tape, we're going to push the needle through the end of the bias tape, and then we're going to throw the needle through the bias tape maker, and holding the thread, we're going to pull out the bias tape. This is it, and using this method, you can feed very easily even the most challenging fabrics through the most narrow bias tape makers. Now, this fifth final sewing headache that we're going to solve today is very niche, but if you sew a lot, and especially if you sew a lot of woven fabrics, I bet there was one time where you met this issue where you apply the interfacing on piece of fabric that you perfectly cut out and the interfacing shrinks. Now, how to solve this issue? I will tell you what my teacher back at sewing school taught me, is that before applying the interfacing, or better yet, before cutting the interfacing, we're going to go ahead and steam it. We're not touching with the iron the interfacing because it has glue, so we're holding it slightly above the interfacing and we're giving a bit of steam so that we can heat and pre-shrink it. Now, from my personal experience, not all interfacings will shrink, but it will happen when you least suspect it and on fabrics that you least want it to happen. So it's a good habit to have that if you're working with new interfacing, you don't know if it's going to shrink or not, just pre-steam it before cutting and applying on your detail, and you will avoid shrinkage completely. This is one of the tips that I share in my intermediate sewing and pattern making course, where we are learning how to create fitted skirts and dresses. So if you want to elevate your sewing game, I will link the course in the description box down below. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you learned something new. I will see you next